glad that you joined us for the latest video on the book of Ruth. We're going to be studying Ruth chapter 3 in its entirety in this video. If you watched our last video, you know we're actually going to study the text of Ruth chapter 3 this time, and then our next video, which will be much briefer, we're going to kind of look at the controversies found in this chapter. A lot of people want to jump straight to that, but we want to kind of take this as just the text unfolds, and then we will spend a few minutes in a couple of weeks when the next video comes out dealing with sort of the did they or didn't they question. If you're not familiar with that, just read Ruth chapter 3, and as we go through this, you'll figure out sort of the question, the controversy that sometimes arises. But I also want to remind you again that we release the audio of these lessons now on our podcast feed. Any podcast app that you have, you can search for A Legacy of Faith, and these are on there, as well as some things Leah and I do about marriage, family, Bible class program, all sorts of things. But we're releasing these on there because a lot of people just prefer the audio, and that's totally understandable. And I'm that way, frankly. Here I'm doing a YouTube video admitting that, but that's just the way it is. But before we get into Ruth chapter 3, let me just ask this question by way of introduction. Have you ever had to put together a huge project? I mean, a huge project. Maybe you had to organize a bunch of people to complete something that took just weeks, even months of planning. And as you went through that process, very likely there were quite a few bumps along the way, but when the project finally came to its completion, you felt relieved, you felt grateful because of the help you had received, you were proud of each person who had worked hard, and you were grateful to God because He had given you the talent as well as the patience and the wisdom and the resources to pull off such a thing. We just like it when we see things come together, especially big events, plans, and things. We just like that. But there are times throughout those processes when we wonder if it's going to work out. We can think, we can plan, we can work, we can pray, but there are always things that we could never foresee coming. There's going to be twists and turns along the way. And no matter what our best effort is, there'll be things we cannot know and that could potentially even sink what we thought were our very best plans. Ruth chapter 3 is the shortest chapter in this book, as we have the book divided into 4 chapters. But in a lot of ways, it is the turning point. While we've been able to sort of peek behind the curtain, and we know as the reader that Boaz is Ruth's near relative, her kinsman redeemer by marriage, we're still wondering, if we don't know how this is going to go, where the story's going. How can Ruth, even though she's caught Boaz's attention, how can she possibly bridge the gaps between their situations, their social classes? This is not meant to be a full list, but think of these 4 differences. He, Boaz, is an Israelite. She is a foreigner. She's a Moabite. He's a wealthy landowner. She is gleaning for her daily sustenance just to survive and help her mother-in-law. She is a widow, and that puts her on the outskirts of society, while he seems to be very much connected within the society. And she is not even directly related to him. She's only connected by her marriage to Naomi's son, and of course, as we've already mentioned, both husbands are dead. It's those sorts of twists and turns, those sorts of situations that make the stuff for a good novel or play or movie, but this is a very real account. The audience wonders, is there any way that this seemingly impossible chasm, could be crossed? And chapter 3 is going to show the plan that's put in place to do that. As I said, we're going to study this from 2 angles. This video is going to go through the text itself. The next video will talk about the controversy. And this is a little bit longer reading. We don't usually read anything quite this long, but we're going to read the entire chapter. It's only 18 verses, but instead of taking it in little sections, we want to see how this whole chapter unfolds, and then we'll go through it bit by bit by way of study. Ruth 3, we'll read the entire chapter beginning in verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, that is Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she, Ruth, replied, "All that you say, I will do." Verse 6, So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly, and uncovered his feet, and lay down. At midnight the man was startled, and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, Who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, Let it not be known that this woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley, and put it on her. And she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, How did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Now again, I know it's a long reading, but I want you to hear the whole context of this chapter, now it's unfolded, and begin with the thought of Ruth's trust in Naomi. You know, chapter 2 had ended on a note that was seemingly positive. You haven't watched those videos, make sure you go back and see where we're at in chapter 3. Ruth, you recall, was allowed to glean not just during the barley harvest, but through the end of that harvest and the wheat harvest. There's another way to read that, though. When those harvests are done, what's Ruth supposed to do? Now, certainly, in that gleaning, they were storing up grain to make bread and to make it through later times, but would it be enough? And further, would there be any other work to do to show support and compassion of mother-in-law? You can read this positively, but you can also read it in sort of a tense way. And it's also possible, and maybe probable, that Boaz was unsure of what he should do next, if anything. As we'll learn later in the book, he has a place of a kinsman redeemer, but as we've seen in chapter 3, he's not the nearest one, the closest one. Should he do anything at all above and beyond what he's already done? But the end of chapter 2 reminds us, for those weeks, probably about 4 to 6 weeks or so that the harvests were going on, Ruth was gleaning. And as such, we're left to presume that she and Boaz saw each other regularly, and we're left to presume that their at least admiration grew, if not their attraction grew. Steve Zeisler wrote this, It is easy to believe that as the days went by, they began to care for each other and appreciate each other. Their attraction for each other grew, not the completely animal-like sexual attraction that so many people settle for today, nor the fantasy attraction that's rooted in the unrealistic romanticism of fairy tales and romance novels. The love that grew between Ruth and Boaz was rooted in a clear-eyed, realistic respect and awareness of the inner reality of each other. As their mutual attraction grew, they approached an important turning point in their relationship, end quote. And Naomi seems to be of the opinion that Ruth needs to be sure to sort of push things a little, but she seems to do so for a good reason. In chapter 3 and verse 1, she states that she wants rest for Ruth, presumably meaning the type of security that a husband would provide. Moffat translates the phrase as, I must see you settled in life. That's probably a good way of thinking about it. But to seek to provide that rest, Naomi turns to Boaz. And it seems clear that she's been thinking of a plan. In verses 2 through 4 that we read earlier, she lays out a detailed plan for Ruth to follow. It'd be the time of year to winnow barley, that is to separate the wheat from the chaff, separate the grain from the chaff. Animals were often used to walk over the grain, and then large fan-like shovels were used to throw the grain up into the air. A breeze would carry away the light, almost like paper-like chaff. The pure grain would fall back down to the ground, and you'd begin to pile up the pure grain. This was the task that Boaz would be doing to ensure that the harvest was pure, that the grain was protected, and Naomi knew it. But Ruth would go where that was being done. But before departing, she was to wash herself, anoint herself, probably put oils on, those sorts of things, and dress in a cloak. And from what we can tell, this doesn't mean that Ruth was to put on her best clothes, because it's possible she doesn't have any best clothes. It's possible, though, that the meaning is she was to put on a mantle that would make it easier to walk through the threshing floor without being recognized. Put on something outer. But upon arrival, she was to wait until Boaz had finished eating and drinking, wait until he laid down, and when he was asleep, uncover his feet and lie down. And at that point, Naomi predicted, Boaz would tell Ruth what to do. That's where we'll get into the controversy in the next lesson. It tells us something of the heart of Ruth, that her response was brief, but it was filled with trust. Verse 5, all that you say, I will do. Clearly, Ruth is at least admiring Boaz, if not attracted to Boaz. But this is quite a plan. And so trust Naomi with something that seems clandestine. That's the idea. And it shows a good heart to her mother-in-law that she was willing to do that. And so the bulk of the chapter then deals with the plan being executed. In verses 6 through 13, Ruth does exactly what she's been told. She arrives at the threshing floor at the right time. She waits until after Boaz has completed his evening meal, maybe his nighttime meal, and laid down. The text tells us his heart was merry, which leads some to believe he was drunk. And while that's possible, it's also possible to simply say he was satisfied with the meal, with the day's work, those sorts of things. Boaz goes to sleep there at the threshing floor, which was not unusual. Doing so would have kept him close to his work to begin the next day. It would have provided a way to be awakened by possible intruders, which is ironic since one is already there, and thus keep his grain safe. We don't know what caused him to be startled at midnight, but it's a funny account, isn't it? As such, he's startled. He sees Ruth laying at his feet, and she's followed Naomi's plan to the very last detail. It's of interest that Boaz doesn't recognize Ruth at first. Now, probably it's simply because it's dark and he's startled at midnight. Most of us, if we're startled in that way, don't recognize much at all. When Naomi gave the plan, she stated that Boaz would tell Ruth what to do. But when Ruth was asked who she was, she's ready with the response. She names herself, but then asks Boaz to spread his wings over her, making it clear he is her redeemer, or a redeemer for the household. And one author suggests that Naomi had basically wanted Ruth not to say anything, to be attractive, to do anything you can to make him want you, one writer said. That's possible, but whether or not that's the case, Ruth is wise enough to speak and say gracious things and true things when this opportunity arises and she's asked who she is. And by the way, as a side note, passages like this are not to be used against dressing up or being attractive. That's not the point here. To turn this into that sort of lesson, as I've heard some do. But the idea here is that Ruth uses wisdom in a moment where she could have used other things. And the phrase, spread your wings, is a statement of great value and beauty. It can also mean to spread a garment. It was used of asking for protection. In Ezekiel chapter 16, the phrase is used of God and how he desired to have his people Israel back in a relationship with him. Ezekiel 16:18, God says, when I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you. And talks about how he made a vow with them and so on. It's also of interest that Boaz himself has used this phrase. Remember when he first met Ruth, he told her that God was the one under whose wings you have come for refuge. Ruth 2, verse 12. Now those words are becoming very, very personal. Boaz is moved by her boldness and her words, stating he admires Ruth for not going after young men, whether they're poor or rich, but instead he says he'll do what she's asking, if it can be done. And it's here that he provides the speed bump in the plan. Because you see, there's another redeemer, another nearer relative to Ruth, and really more literally to Naomi, than he is. Ferguson writes, biblical narratives often share a similar pattern. When the work of God begins to advance, obstacles appear in the way, end quote. And we often see that in any life. Deuteronomy 25 is the key text about the caring of a widow by a living relative. In great detail, the law of Moses laid down the principle that would become known as levirate marriage. By the way, that comes from a Latin term, L-E-V-I-R. I probably pronounced lever or levir, which means brother-in-law. Deuteronomy 25, 5 and 6 states, quote, If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her, and the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the dead brother, and his name may not be blotted out of Israel. That's the law that's behind this. By law, there's nothing Boaz can do unless that nearer redeemer, the nearer relative, refuses to fulfill his role in redeeming Ruth and also redeeming Naomi. But Boaz makes it clear that should that nearer redeemer refuse that role, he will accept that responsibility. There's obviously a level of admiration and attraction here. Now, Boaz asks Ruth to stay the night, and again, our next lesson will talk about the controversy that surrounds that. And he tells her to hold out her garment, and he graciously gives her more than enough grain to take home. The grain is used as visual proof that Boaz has taken care of Ruth, and it's really meant to give Naomi peace of mind, as well as obviously food, but also just that there has been care here. And in fact, Boaz overflows with generosity because the amount of grain he sends home with Ruth would have been a large amount to carry, especially just in the folds of a garment. I mean, can you picture him maybe flirtatiously piling on a few more scoops of grain? He's wanting Naomi to see that Ruth is truly taken care of and that everything's going to be okay. One writer said, as the grain in Ruth's shawl spills over onto the floor, does Naomi get the message at last? She returned from Moab empty, and she will be empty no longer, end quote. And so Naomi, when she sees the grain, trusts Boaz's heart. As chapter 3 closes, she is sure that Boaz will not let the day pass until he has tried to work out this issue of redemption. The first word Naomi said to Ruth, the word wait, is possibly the most difficult command given to Ruth in this entire book. Her entire future lies in the balance, and there's nothing she can do now except wait and see if Boaz really is the kind of man that Naomi claims he is, and that Ruth obviously feels that he is. Now, most of us are familiar with how the book turns out. But if you are reading this for the first time, or trying to read it as if it's the first time, this is a huge moment of tension. It seems as if Ruth and Naomi have done everything they know to do, and it's time to see, will the plan work? Will Boaz take care of this? Will he do it on that day? Will the nearer redeemer decide to take responsibility and thus crush this budding romance between Ruth and Boaz? If you were in Ruth's shoes, you'd probably be pacing the floor, trying to work like crazy to keep your mind occupied. This is one of those times where a plan has worked so far, but the end result is totally out of your hands. And all Ruth and Naomi can do is wait and see if the plan really has worked and will work. And we're going to leave it hanging there as well. As I said in our next video, we're going to go back through chapter 3, much briefer lesson, just to talk about the controversy in chapter 3, because it is there, it's real. And then we will go back in and finish up the book in a couple of videos dealing with chapter 4. I hope these lessons are encouraging in your Bible study. Make sure you like and subscribe to the videos, as well as subscribe to the podcast. You rather hear the audio of these. We hope all these things encourage you in this great book of the Bible, the book of Ruth. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.